Hello again everyone, and welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we are going to be taking a look at the recently released Flight Replicas P-40N WarHawk. Many of you, I'm sure, will be aware that in true Microsoft Flight Simulator fashion, we already have a couple of P-40 options available in the sim. At the moment, we have the Big Radial's P-40B as well as the Build's P-40F, and now, as I say, we have the P-40N. Personally, I'm not sure whether or not the sim really needs another WarHawk unless it's done to a significantly higher standard than the competition. But with that being said, I'm sure that many of you familiar with the channel will know that I am a bit of a sucker for a warbird, so I was quite keen to give the aircraft a try and see what the product has to offer. As a result, this video is as much for me as it is for you, really just having some fun in the WarHawk and seeing what we find along the way. We've got some great scenery as well for the flight today, once again catching up with a couple of burning blue design sceneries. We're going to be taking the aircraft on a short hop from Damyns Hall just out to the east of London, up towards Earls Colne. As usual, we're going to be carrying out a full flight, so I'll try and give you a good feel for the aircraft's fidelity in terms of systems, flight modelling. We'll hear the sounds, take a look at the visual model as we go. And of course, at the end of the video, I'll summarise what I think of the product. I think it is worth mentioning ahead of the review that the Flight Replicas WarHawk does retail for a significantly higher price than the competition. As such, I'm really expecting and hoping for a high level of quality in terms of the aircraft systems modelling, flight modelling, things of that nature. Anyway, once again, we are currently on the ground at Damyns Hall. As you can see, we've just pulled the aircraft from the hangar, so let's head for the cockpit and we'll get the old warbird fired up. So we find ourselves in the cockpit of yet another P-40. This time, of course, it is the Flight Replicas P-40N. Overall, I have to say, Flight Replicas have done a very nice job with the cockpit, and I have to say I actually slightly prefer the aesthetic they have here with the P-40N versus the Build's version of the aircraft. Systems-wise, broadly the same level of fidelity I would say, although there are a few exceptions there, and we'll obviously talk about those as we go. So running through the start checks, fuel selector can go onto fuselage for the start. Got the aircraft fully fueled up today, as you can see there, just checking all three fuel gauges, all showing the full fuel load. Throttle will set 1 inch open. Mixture. Mixture is definitely one of the systems that seems to be modelled incorrectly currently. We should have an auto lean, auto rich and full rich position, but currently we just have idle cutoff or full rich. And using my hardware controls there as well, doesn't seem to actuate the mixture. So for now, mixture set fully rich. Prop lever is set to high RPM. Battery master can go on. And same there for the generator. It's very quiet, but overall the cockpit sounds are pretty good. Fuel pump switch can go on. Fuel pressure is checked. We'll prime 5 times. It's fairly cold day outside today, around 9 degrees. So engine is primed. Mags can go on to both. Checking the prop area. It's all clear, we'll give them a shout.
Clear prop!
And to start, we can either use the mag switch as a nice little concession for the sim, but we do also have the starter switch located down on the left. So we're going to engage. The engine firing up very easily there, no associated smoke there really either as well. And overall the sounds are so. I believe the aircraft is using the default P-51 sounds from the Asobo P-51. So nice sound set overall, but it is basically a default sound set. A little bit disappointing there. Anyway, we do have a good start. Oil pressure has come up into the green. Oil temperature, as you can see, that's slowly coming up, just coming up through 40 degrees Celsius currently. We want to be up at around 60 here before we depart. Coolant temperature looks good, again in the green. Flaps are currently selected up. And just checking the flap indications. We'll just test the flap operation here. Split flap, so we can't actually see, but you can see there we do have a flap indicator pin located on the rear of the wing. And up at the front of the wing there as well, we have a gear indication. So flaps are checked, we'll bring those in once again. Cow flaps we'll set to fully open. Quite a strange sound there associated with the operation of the cow flaps. It almost sounds like an electrical actuation. I believe in reality these are mechanically operated, so a little bit strange there on the sounds. Anyway, lights are set as required. ADI we can uncage. The flight instruments, QNH is 1020. That's giving us an aerodrome elevation there of around 20 feet. Interestingly, a real bug with the aircraft currently, so going off the compass there we have a heading of 210, and checking that against the directional gyro, everything looks good. Unfortunately though, setting the directional gyro also sets the whiskey compass currently, which of course is not accurate. And it also means that should we inadvertently set the whiskey compass as I've already done, we now have no correct heading reference, and using the D key, which generally is the standard key to reset the directional indicator in the aircraft, that doesn't seem to work, so we're a little bit lost now in terms of heading reference. We'll have to align that again once we're on the runway. So as you can see so far, a bit of a mixed bag in terms of systems fidelity. There are some nice aspects to the aircraft, but a few things that certainly need fixing up as well. Anyway, flight instruments are set, testing the flight controls. Some flickering as well on the glass, that's pretty typical in the sim. Anyway, flight controls are full and free. Coming back on the stick, we'll take the park brake off. The aircraft on the roll there under a very small amount of power, which may well be reasonable. And the P-40 very easy to taxi. Actually, the steering's pretty sensitive. I've only got a very small amount of rudder input here currently, and you can see the aircraft turning quite nicely. We don't really need any brake even to sharpen up the turn. And actually picking up quite a bit of speed here, so just having to ride the brakes. We'll come back slightly further on the throttle. We'll get ourselves lined up here on the runway, and then we'll carry out the run-up. And we don't have much wind around here this morning, looking at that windsock, but slightly favouring out towards the southwest. So we are nicely lined up, gently onto the brakes. And once again the park brake can go on. So just before we carry out the run-up, once again checking the temperatures and pressures. Everything's come up nicely now into the green. So for the run-up checks, the park brake is set, throttle, again just back on the stick, will come up to 1800 RPM. And again, quite nice sounds there, but they are the default Asobo P-51 sounds. So incorrect for the aircraft. The P-40N, I believe, uses an Allison V12 engine, whereas the P-51 uses a Packard Merlin engine. Anyway, there's 1800. Once again, temperatures and pressures looking good. We'll check the mags. So onto the left. Not seeing much of a drop there. And back to both. Onto the right, maybe seeing a very slight drop, around 20 RPM if anything. And back to both. We'll cycle the prop. And prop's good. All temperature there's come right up to the red line. They came up very quickly as well. So definitely a very mixed bag in terms of systems fidelity, quite a few peculiarities so far with the aircraft. Going all the way back to idle on the throttle. The engine feels pretty simplistic so far in terms of its modelling. Idling around 500 RPM. Come back up to 1000. And pretty much all good to go. Right, so we're lined up here on runway 21. We've just reset the whiskey compass and the directional indicator there as well. Park brake can come off. And as usual, just slowly coming up on the throttle. The P-40N actually very benign in terms of its takeoff handling characteristics, probably unrealistically so. Very easy to control on the ground. Let's continue to come up on the throttle. There's 50 inches on the manifold pressure. Very little swing in either direction, easy to correct with the rudder. And the aircraft actually lifting off their tail down. Anyway, climbing away nicely, we'll tap the brakes, gear can come up. And we'll come back now to 45 inches manifold pressure. Interestingly there as well, the RPM not coming all the way through to 3000. You can see we're only getting around 2200 RPM currently, which I don't believe would be accurate. Anyway, climbing away up towards the southwest, we'll get the canopy closed up. And we're looking for a heading of 034. So we'll start a left-hand turn out of Damyns Hall. Fairly light cloud around here at low level, so we'll just continue the climb for now. Get ourselves up to around 5,000 feet. And off the left wing there's Damyns Hall, just buried behind that little bank of cloud. We'll keep climbing here, we'll get ourselves above this first cloud layer. And shortly come on to our heading. Yeah, so as I said, the P-40N, very benign handling characteristics during the takeoff. Pretty much no swing whatsoever in either direction really. Even more straightforward arguably than a Cessna 152 in terms of its handling characteristics. We'll just stay on a heading of around 015 for now to get ourselves back on flight plan track. And you can see there now as the speed building up, the RPM's coming up as well. We'll check out the prop again later on, but I suspect there's a little bit of a bug there. We didn't get full RPMs there during the takeoff. There's 5,000 feet, so we'll level off. Come back to 35 inches on the manifold pressure. And we'll just leave the RPM fully forward for now, as again we're only getting around 2300 RPM. At the moment the P-40 definitely has a bit of a right wing down tendency, so we'll trim some of that out. And needing quite a lot of trim there to correct actually. You can see that the ball there on the turn slip indicator is out to the left. Continuing to trim though, not seeing too much change so far in that turn and slip indicator. And the aircraft really wanted to climb as well, already up through 6,000 feet there. So trim pretty slow to actuate, which I don't mind as an add-on. It means it's obviously a little bit easier to trim more accurately. We're not really seeing very much effect there with the rudder trim, just using pitch trim at the moment. We'll level off at 6,000. Up through 2,500 RPM now, so the speed comes up through about 250 miles an hour. But still very much right wing heavy currently in the aircraft. So just continuing to work our way around here through the rudder trim. We've got quite a lot of rudder trim on now. And now that ball is centered up quite nicely. And okay, the aircraft is now flying quite nicely in terms of straight level performance. So 2,500 RPM, we'll start coming back on that prop. Go for about 2,300. Noticing quite a bit of shimmering there as well on the panel, from the instrument lighting presumably. We'll try turning that down. That's just shimmering in general. I've noticed, again, it's pretty common in the sim to have shimmering effects on aircraft, particularly on glass surfaces, but there does seem to be a little bit more than is usual on the Flight Replicas P-40 so far. Anyway, nicely established now here in the cruise. Again, the aircraft just wanting to climb, so keep trimming forwards. Down to around 40 gallons in the fuselage tank. We'll stay on the fuselage tank until we've burned our way through that, so probably for the entirety of the flight today. Leaving London behind us, that's just off somewhere out at our 7-8 o'clock position. You can see the Thames there, just leaving that behind as well. This is going to be a nice short sector for us today. Again, planning to track out towards Earls Colne. And in terms of any en route features here, we're pretty much flying direct to the airfield, but we do have Chelmsford en route, so we'll just use that as a little bit of a midway waypoint. Anyway, let's get a bit more of a feel for the aircraft handling. The aircraft feels pretty stable once you've got it trimmed out. Overall, in terms of roll, there's definitely a feeling of weight there, which is nice. We'll perform some aerobatic manoeuvres once we're overhead Earls Colne, so we'll save off on those for now. But again, overall the aircraft feels quite nice in terms of its handling. Let's go for a little bit of an aileron roll. Definitely a nice high roll rate there, which I believe is true to life of the real world P40, so that's good to see. And in terms of pitch, definitely quite a bit lighter there on the elevator. But I would say a little bit less so than the Unibuild's P40, so overall the aircraft are broadly on a par with each other in terms of handling, maybe slightly preferring the Flight Replicas version of the aircraft so far. But so far in terms of systems issues that we've seen, we've already talked of course about the whiskey compass. I think there's an issue there as well with the prop. We weren't getting full RPMs. We'll just dive here, try and pick up some speed, see how the prop behaves there. I have read some issues about the prop not really behaving in the correct sense in terms of being a constant speed prop. Obviously at the moment the aircraft should maintain the RPM here as we build up speed. That seems to be working okay so far, I'm not seeing any issues there. So just coming overhead Chelmsford, we're about halfway over towards Earls Colne currently. We've got the town of Colchester off to our 2 o'clock off in the distance. Again with the cloud today, unfortunately a little bit trickier to sight a lot of features en route. There was maybe a slight change in RPM there with the prop, as we've come back on the speed again. So very mixed feelings about the Flight Replicas P40 so far. I have to say I'm not overly impressed with the product for its price. Visually I think it's very beautiful, although the PBR externally not as good as the Unibuild's version. But systems, definitely a few issues there that do need fixing up. I think we've covered some of those. And again, systems fidelity broadly on a par with the Unibuild's version of the aircraft. For example, the circuit breakers there not working, and various controls throughout the cockpit not working as well, mostly related to weapons controls. So for me, the Flight Replicas P40 so far feels okay. It's a little bit of a hollow experience. The sounds, again, not bad, but they are default sounds and not correct for the aircraft, as we've discussed. Just something feels slightly lacking. I think it's probably the depth behind the engine modelling, for example. It doesn't feel much like a warbird. There's no real challenge there in terms of ground handling, engine handling. They have a very beautiful version of the aircraft, but doesn't have a whole lot of character to it, I would say. And especially given the price. Obviously we do have 2 other P40 options available, and I would say the Unibuild's P40 is, I think, almost half the price of the Flight Replicas version, and pretty much every bit as good in terms of what I've seen so far. Anyway, we should be somewhere roughly overhead Earls Colne now, so we'll just make a turn out to the right here. We should see the airfield somewhere off the left wing. We should have Colchester out off the right wing, which you do. You can see the UK coastline there as well. And we should have Earls Colne somewhere just down below us. One of the great things about this sim, always a little bit trickier to spot airfields. They blend in very nicely, but sure enough, there's Earls Colne just down off the left wing. So we know the wind is somewhat out towards the southwest. We'll come in on what looks to be runway 24. Once we've got some altitude in hand, might as well carry out some aerobatic manoeuvres. So we'll just open up the cowl flaps. Once again, we'll go for the combat climb setting. Once again, coming all the way up on the prop. And we'll come up to 45 inches manifold pressure. So again, just demonstrating the roll rate, full deflection out to the left, back around 220 miles an hour. Again, quite a high roll rate from the aircraft, nice to see. Get ourselves here lined up with the runway, we'll go for a loop. So building up some speed, we'll come through about 350 miles an hour. That prop now just coming up on 3000 RPM. There's 350, back on the stick. Yeah, as I say, I think the aircraft does have slightly more of a feeling of weight to it in pitch than we've seen from the Ini-Builds version of the aircraft. Certainly initially on release, the Ini-Builds version of the aircraft had quite a few issues in terms of pitch authority. It was very lightweight on the elevator. Just pitching down there as well, again, definitely more of a feeling of weight versus the competition. The aircraft is reasonably good fun to fly. It's quite enjoyable to throw around as we're doing right now. But there are certainly better options out there in the sim, I have to say. I think the flight model, though, slightly better than the other two options available in terms of P40s. So there's one plus point for the Flight Replicas version of the aircraft. We'll go for a stall. Power off initially. We'll just continue the climb here. Bleed off a little bit of speed. Coming back through 200 miles an hour. You do notice, as the speed changes with that trim in now, the aircraft feeling slightly different to fly. So aerodynamically there is a little bit of change there at speed, but I presume that's the stall warning light there, or maybe the landing gear warning light. But again, no real aerodynamic effects at all in terms of engine power changes. And so far the aircraft very benign in the stall. So down at around 60 miles an hour there, wanting to drop the left wing. Just keeping back on the stick. And we do develop into somewhat of a spin, but releasing the controls and the aircraft recovers all by itself. So pretty benign there in terms of the power off stall. We'll try a power on stall. Just going to keep the nose pretty high here to bleed off the speed fairly quickly. Earls Colne should be off the right wing, still visual with the airfield. Okay, down through 100 miles an hour. And again back towards 60. Quite surprised the aircraft stalls that slowly. And this time dropping the right wing. Still fully back on the stick. And again they're developing into somewhat of a spin, back off the throttle. Just releasing a little bit of back pressure on the stick and the aircraft recovering. So pretty benign overall there at low speed. Make our way now in towards Earls Colne. We'll do a low level fly past off the runway and then we'll make a bit of a teardrop approach back in onto the westerly runway. So back up to 40 inches manifold pressure. That prop RPM does continue to creep up there at speed, but that makes sense since we're fully forward at the moment and the prop again does seem to have a couple of issues. So coming down runway 06. Okay, so continuing our climbing turn out to the right, come off the throttle, start letting that speed come back. And just coming down through 200 miles an hour, we get the canopy opened up once again. Running through our downwind checks, brakes are checked and off, undercarriage will take down. Start turning back inbound towards the field. Looks to be all clear on final. Undercarriage is checked down. Mixture is set fully rich. Fuel pump is on. Just coming down through 40 scans now in the main tank. So Earls Colne just coming off the left wing. We'll tighten up the turn slightly. We can start configuring as well. Flight instruments are checked. Harness is secure. Not quite sure what the deal is at Earls Colne with the runway. It looks as though we've got a grass runway with a hardened surface out to the left. We'll take the grass runway. That lines up nicely with the numbers. Obviously as well pretty suitable for the P40. Still showing a touch high here on the Pappies, but happy we're going to be able to correct that. We'll just slide set the aircraft slightly here as well. Visibility over the nose of the P40N is not particularly brilliant. So once again, gear is down, flaps are down. Running through our finals checks, pitch is full fine, undercarriage is down, flaps are set. Landing clearance not required, the runway is clear. Looking good in terms of our speed. Again though, very noticeable, no change really in terms of how the aircraft flies at different power settings. Even back here at low speed as we come up and down on the throttle, pretty benign in terms of any handling changes. Still just a little bit high, so coming off that power again, maybe just a touch high as well on the speed. Nicely lined up here though on runway 24. We'll straighten up the nose, just continuing to slowly reduce that power and holding the aircraft off. There's touchdown. Just a little bit of a bounce. Back on the stick, slowly coming onto the brakes. And again, the aircraft very straightforward in terms of ground handling. Very easy to keep straight on the runway. Again, just that slight bounce, but I think we can put that one down to my flying. So just coming over the departure end of 06, nice and slow now for the taxi. We'll roll our way through towards the parking area. So there you go guys, I do hope you enjoyed our outing in the Flight Replicas P-40N WarHawk. Once again, given that the Flight Replicas P-40 is more expensive than both the big radials and the UniBuilds options, I'm going to judge the aircraft accordingly. Broadly speaking, I would say that the Flight Replicas P-40N is on a par with both the UniBuilds P-40 and the big radials P-40, but again, given the price, given the additional cost of purchasing this particular variant, I was hoping for more fidelity from the aircraft overall. Anyway, as usual, we'll break things down into some positives and negatives. We'll start with the negatives and move on towards the positives. There are currently quite a few significant negatives, I have to say, with the product, although I'm sure some of those will be fixed up. They're quite clearly bugs. I was expecting the P-40N to outperform the UniBuilds P-40 on the systems front, again given that price increase, and generally speaking, I really didn't see that to be the case. There were quite a few systems inoperative on the aircraft, as well as a couple of systems inaccuracies that I picked up along the way. Generally speaking, the systems modelling did feel pretty mid-range, and the engine modelling as well we discussed felt pretty simplistic. The same goes with the aircraft sound set really. Once again, the P-40N I believe uses the default Asobo P51 sounds. Not a bad sound package in of itself, but again at this sort of price point, custom sounds would certainly be nice. I know it is harder for these smaller developers to create custom sound sets. No excuse though, for example, not hearing any adjustment to the sound there with the canopy both open and closed. Probably the most significant issue currently with the aircraft, and we didn't really get a chance to go into it during the video, but there's definitely some sort of an FPS bug currently with the P-40N. General FPS on the WarHawk is actually very good. I was getting about 79 FPS in the P-40 versus around 81 in the default Cessna 152. But again, there does seem to be this significant FPS impact, I found at least when operating the aircraft from grass runways. You get a huge FPS hit, which seems to get progressively worse as well. It brought mine all the way down to around 18 frames per second. At that point, the sim becomes a bit of a jerky mess. It makes the aircraft pretty much unusable, unfortunately, from grass runways as it stands. But again, this is not the sort of issue you expect to see making it through the beta testing and into the release candidate. A couple of other things that would have been nice to see. As best I can tell, there's no drop tank available on the aircraft. Similarly, no real armaments, as the aircraft is currently only available from the in-sim marketplace, which is a bit of a shame. So in summary for my negatives, again it really comes down to systems fidelity and some fairly obvious bugs, both of which I would have liked to have seen an improvement upon. In terms of what the Flight Replicas P-40N does well, there's certainly a very beautiful model to be had. Externally, I think the aircraft looks great, although I will still say that I think IndyBuilds did a slightly better job with both the PBR and the aircraft effects, for example engine exhaust. Internally though, I think that Flight Replicas get my vote there. The interior of the P-40N looks excellent. Certainly, to my eyes at least, visually better than the IndyBuilds version, although there is less functionality, for example no onboard tablet, no real configuration options to speak of. I think as well that the Flight Replicas WarHawk has a slight advantage in terms of the flight modelling. Without a doubt, on the ground the handling is very simplistic, but once you have the aircraft in the air, again I think it has an edge in terms of flight modelling. Nevertheless, the flight model is still quite some way off being study level, I would say. For example, once again we noticed no real torque effect, any yawing motion with changes in engine power. As I say, I did have high hopes for the aircraft. A few of the things we've mentioned here are fairly obvious bugs, and again hopefully those will get fixed up. But personally, I think the aircraft is going to need further work in terms of its systems depth, its flight modelling, its sounds, if it really wants to justify that higher price point versus the competition. I think we've probably got enough P-40s available now within the sim, though of course if A2A choose to bring theirs into Microsoft Flight Simulator, we'll absolutely be taking a look at that. Anyway, ladies and gents, once again I do hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel. As ever, a very big thank you to my channel members and patrons for all of your support. It is thoroughly appreciated. I do hope that all of you are having a great day wherever you are. Take really good care, and I will see you all again soon.